There's nothing like watching your mirror image, like the person who has been your person your entire life, slowly disintegrate. Life as we knew it was fundamentally going to change forever. When I gave up hope for myself, I kept fighting to be her mother. I went from being almost on death's door to having that door reopened and a whole long life being there. Someone's life ended so my life could continue.
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Today I'm speaking with Jessica Chappell. Jessica is a passionate advocate for organ and tissue donation whose life was saved by a liver transplant in 2022 after a diagnosis of autoimmune hepatitis. For years, Jessica lived with the uncertainty, exhaustion, and the invisible toll of chronic illness until the call came that changed everything. Her journey from patient to a powerful voice in the donor community has inspired thousands, with her story featured in Mamma Mia and Humans in Melbourne. Jessica now shares her experience to raise awareness, break down misconceptions, and honour the gift of life she received from a complete stranger. With empathy, honesty, and strength, Jessica speaks to the emotional realities of waiting, surviving, and living with purpose after transplant. Her message is simple but urgent. Organ donation transforms lives, and every conversation counts.
There's nothing like watching your mirror image, like the person who has been your person your entire life, slowly disintegrate. Life as we knew it was fundamentally going to change forever. When I gave up hope for myself, I kept fighting to be her mother. I went from being almost on death's door to having that door reopened and a whole long life being there. Someone's life ended so my life could continue.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Jessica.
Look, thank you for having me, Catherine.
So, can you take us back to the beginning when you first realised something wasn't quite right with your health?
Well, the really interesting thing is, Catherine, I didn't really notice that anything was seriously wrong. It was whilst I was pregnant with my first daughter, Meadow, and it wasn't until actually I went into labour and went to hospital and delivered Meadow that, unbeknownst to me, my illness had actually started shortly after delivery. And Meadow was 6 weeks prem, and we guarded her at home without any visitors and didn't take her out into the real world. So I was plodding along at home like all new mothers, breastfeeding and up all hours and quite tired and fatigued and losing weight. But I put that all down to being a new mum. I thought this was part and parcel of what motherhood entailed. And so I didn't actually notice myself that anything was terribly wrong. And it wasn't until Meadow was 12 weeks old and we had arranged her baptism. And whilst we were standing in the receiving line to greet all of our family, my Aunt Linda, who is a nurse, she took one look at me up close and she said, "Jess, are you feeling okay?" And I said, yeah, happy that you're here and a little bit tired. And she said, "Are you sure you're feeling okay? You look a bit yellow." And I said, "No, I'm okay." And she said, "Give me a look at your eyes." And unbeknownst to me, the whites of my eyes were quite yellow, very close to turmeric yellow. And she had a look at my gums, which were quite grey. And she said, "Look, I actually think something is very seriously wrong. I think you need to leave and go straight to emergency." So that's exactly what we did. And within 24 hours, I had been diagnosed with a chronic illness that was life-threatening called autoimmune hepatitis.
So, what does that diagnosis look like? What did you find out at that point?
At that moment, it was a bit of a blur, to be perfectly honest. If you can picture a new mum and my
Mm.
husband, Chris, and a newborn baby in the emergency department at Geelong Hospital, listening to a team of gastroenterologists and the emergency department senior chiefs, all looking very serious. And I was really focused on Meadow. I was worried about breastfeeding and I was worried about she was crying. And so I actually didn't really absorb too much of it. And what I came to learn pretty quickly is that life as we knew it was fundamentally going to change forever. We learned within 48 hours that the condition was incurable, that the condition would one day essentially either take my life or require a transplant, and that my only prognosis would be transplantation or death. So it was very confronting news for a new mum, and probably even more confronting for my husband.
And what happened then? How do you then go from that moment of, you had your daughter Meadows christening, and
Yep.
now 48 hours, this is where you were at and this is what you're being told. What sort of supports were provided, and what was the process that you found yourself in from there on in?
In the beginning, it's fair to say there's a lot of denial. Oh, it can't be as bad as what they say. And of course, I'm no medical scientist. And so a lot of the information sort of sails over your head a little bit. And I really tried to understand what it would mean in the immediate term. So my immediate concern was, what is treatment? What is going to happen right now? And so over the really short term, because I'd gone untreated for 12 weeks from the day of delivery, so autoimmune hepatitis can be triggered by the hormonal surge caused by delivery hormones in women. Autoimmune hepatitis is a condition that can be experienced by both men and women, but it tends to present in women of childbearing age.
Yeah,
And
right.
so learning as I went, both for me and my family, so two things crossed my mind immediately. One is that my identical twin was pregnant at the time and yet to deliver her
Wow.
first child. And so, in that emergency treatment phase, the treating doctors very quickly picked up that I was an identical twin. They very quickly contacted my sister and her doctor, and she was screened immediately as someone who was 8 months pregnant. And so, fundamentally, they have saved her life. And she went into preventative treatment before delivery and close monitoring after the delivery of her daughter. So the immediate phase for me was critical. I was then admitted to Geelong Hospital, but like all new mums, I didn't want to be admitted and did not want to
Mm.
be separated from my newborn baby. And incredibly, because we had private health insurance, Geelong Hospital and Geelong Private were able to structure a way for me to be admitted with Meadow,
Oh,
and
wow.
our journey began. And Meadow spent the next 6 weeks of her life in hospital with me, and they structured my immediate treatment to stop what is called the flare. So essentially the scarring of the liver that eventually leads to cirrhosis and liver failure. The treatment is enormous amounts of medical grade prednisolone. It arrests the inflammation, it stops it in its tracks fundamentally. And we structured our treatment in a way that meant I would have the treatment, the infusion in the morning. I would then breast pump and express milk to shed the steroid load, and then I would repump so I could then breastfeed Meadow. And I became a bit of a milk factory for a while, all whilst trying to stabilize the condition.
It's so amazing that the medical team was able to work with you to make sure that you could still go through those processes that you wanted to honour as a mum and a new mum. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was an incredible tribute to the Geelong medical community. I had the chronic illness autoimmune team. I had the gastroenterology team, both public and private, because my case was such a rare case. And then I had the obstetric team and the maternal child health team coming in to check on Meadow, to test my breast milk to make sure that I was allowing enough time between treatment and feeding. My mother and my husband, I always had an adult in my room, so I was never directly lifting or bathing my baby. My mother and my husband, Chris, took primary parental responsibility, and I essentially was there for skin contact and to continue feeding her during that time.
And what do you think, looking back on it now, that process allowed you to do, bonding with Meadow?
I think it did a couple of things. It gave me a 100% laser focus on Meadow and actually not myself. And so I didn't process the enormity and the seriousness of my condition until I was released with Meadow to go home. So I didn't really consider the long-term prognosis for myself. At that time, I did not know that my plans to have any further children had been extinguished. I did not know my immunity was permanently compromised. I did not know that I would need to be on a medical management plan and systematic blood tests and gastroscopies and medical. I had no idea what was coming. I had absolutely no idea. So whilst I had a brief moment of sheer relief that I could stay with my baby and I could give her those precious early weeks of nurturing and breast milk and give her the immunity that she so desperately needed as a premature bub. But really, I ended up dealing with my own reality, which is quite often the thing for patients that have a chronic illness diagnosis. There is a lot of perhaps denial or not quite accepting the enormity of what a chronic illness diagnosis carries, not just for you, but for your immediate family as well.
And tell me, what did that look like for you when you had left the hospital after those 6 weeks and you were home? When did the reality hit of what you were actually facing?
I think we sort of fumbled our way through that first year. There's a lot of learning that happens with a chronic illness. So, learning your treatment plan and getting to know your primary practitioners and getting used to who's who in the zoo. And so the first 12 months went by in a real blur. I got to know my treating team really well. I got to know the team at Austin Health, the liver transplant unit, really well. And it became a new normal. So getting blood tests weekly, seeing my gastro once a month. And I was stabilized quite well, which meant they stopped that critical flare. And by taking a series of medications, I was able to stabilize myself and start parenting again and actually returned to work. So in those early years, I was able, with the help of an incredible team of doctors and allied health specialists, was able to resume my normal life for a number of years.
And at what point did you realize, okay, maybe this is not going to be the way things are for the time being? What point did you kind of realize that work was getting a little harder and
Yeah, so if we fast forward from 2010 to about the Christmas of 2018, I had been increasingly becoming unwell. I was incredibly fatigued. I was finding it more and more difficult to recall information. And I was suffering from what many in the medical field would understand is a toxic medical load. So by 2018, I was taking 11 different medications to stay well enough to function.
wow?
And One day at home in late 2018, I collapsed. I collapsed quite hard on the floor in my bathroom. I smashed my face onto the tiles and I started hemorrhaging profusely. And Meadow found me as an 8-year-old and screamed and rang 000, and the ambulance came, and that's when we knew that it was pretty bad. So I was treated in Geelong and I was transferred by ambulance to the Austin, and I remained at the Austin for a number of weeks. I was very unwell, and so unwell, in fact, that the conversation was not had with me. The conversation was held with my husband, and he remembers it quite distinctly. The head of the transplant unit sat down with Chris and said, "Your wife is a young mum. This is not a quality of life that we would anticipate for any young family. It's time to waitlist her for a transplant. Her prognosis is critical, and once she recovers from this incident, it's time to get ready for a transplant."
And how did you feel that the conversation was had with your husband and not yourself directly?
I was critically unwell. I
Okay.
was in and out of consciousness. I was in a lot of pain. And at that stage, I was suffering from a medical condition called hepatic encephalopathy. And I lost my motor skills. I couldn't speak. I couldn't be my own health advocate. I couldn't speak a coherent sentence. My husband had no idea what I was saying, and I didn't recognize my own family. I was so incredibly unwell. I was in intensive care right at the beginning of COVID at that time, and we knew it was pretty serious. And it wasn't until I'd regained my faculties and knew where I was and understand how sick I was that both the doctor and my husband sat down with me and said, "Yep, it's time."
And had you had previous conversations about your wishes prior to that time?
Yeah, so it's one of the important things that happens once you start being as a regional patient living in Geelong. You have sort of a treatment team. So I was regularly having testing and appointments with my team in Geelong, and then periodically going up to the Austin liver transplant unit for regular oversight and management and tweaking of my medical plan, all with the view to planning when my transplant would eventually be, and choosing there's a really small, narrow window with chronic illness. You have to be sick enough to be eligible for the transplant list, but not too sick that makes you ineligible for a transplant. So there is a medical sweet spot. And I had, unfortunately, with collapsing at home, had fallen well over the line for being eligible, almost to the point where I was so sick I was uneligible for a transplant. So I remained in hospital for a long, long time, months stabilising at the Austin until I was well enough to go home, recoup my strength, and then return to the Austin for what they call, and all transplant recipients will know, it's called Workup Week, where you run a week-long battery of tests to ensure that your body is well enough to receive an organ. You are then placed on the waiting list, and you can wait anywhere from a day to 18 months, like I did.
I so want to talk to that point because that is a very long waiting period and such a uncertainty. If you sort of like if it could be anything from 1 day to 18 months, that's a very long period of time. But just before we go there, and Jessica, you don't have to answer this if you don't feel comfortable, but something that I do wonder is that sort of tipping point that you're talking about, it must be a very challenging thing to work out at what point that is, given the fact that, from my limited knowledge and my understanding with me managing my chronic pain, anyone who deals with a chronic illness, my understanding is that your tolerance and your resilience, or maybe your tolerance actually increases sometimes as time goes on. So it really has to escalate to another level before you really have to raise to another level, if that's making sense. And so by the nature of having a chronic illness, it must be very difficult to work out at what point that tipping point is.
Yes, and looking back on it now as a well person that is not experiencing any symptoms whatsoever, there is a real clarity around when chronic becomes critical. And it's something that I talk about quite frequently. When I was first diagnosed and I had a management plan and a series of appointments, and I was in control of dosing myself and driving myself to appointments and taking my own notes following appointments. I was able to do that until Meadow was about 8 years old. And then it became more difficult to remember what was being said in appointments. It became more difficult to remember if I'd taken my medication or if I had an appointment that day, or maybe it was the next week. And when I found myself finding it difficult to do the right thing or remember the right thing, my mother, Joy, who was retired, and I said to my husband, I said, I'm scared. I'm getting scared. I don't think I can be at home alone with Meadow. I'm worried that if something happens to me. And so there is a real difference between chronic illness and critical illness. And it's quite often that tipping point is when you no longer feel like you are comfortably in control of your choices. And so I'm very grateful to my husband and my mother. My mother dropped everything in the height of COVID when there was a ring around Melbourne, and we had to write and get special permission from the Premier of Victoria for my mother to break the ring to drive out of Melbourne and cross, the line of police and Defence Force personnel that were guarding the highway between Melbourne and Geelong. And every Sunday night she would come down to Geelong, and so my husband could still work. She would be with me all day. And at that time, Meadow wasn't at school. All the children were at home, homeschooling at their kitchen tables.
Mm.
And my mother would homeschool Meadow, wake me up, give insulin injections, had extended to daily hospital in the home appointments with nursing staff and pathology staff. That's when you know. That's when you know that you are no longer in the driving seat of your life. And that's when I, as my mum and my husband both tell me, I'm not a great patient, not a great patient at all when I'm not in control. But that's when I knew. That's when I knew that I was fearful for what might happen.
And during this time, what was your conversations with Meadow around your illness?
We tried to protect Meadow for a long, long time. She knew that I was unwell, and she knew that I took tablets, and she knew that I had really friendly doctors that she really loved, and that I had an illness. And we were tried to be very sensitive to Meadow. So at that time, she was 7 years old. She, was thriving at school. And so we just started to approach my illness with illnesses that she was familiar with. So she was very familiar with diabetes, and she was very familiar with nut allergies being in the school system. And so we compared my illness to those illnesses and said, mummy has to be very careful with what she eats, and she has to be very careful about when she takes her medicine. And like diabetes, she tests her blood and she regularly sees the doctor to make sure that she's well enough to take care of you. And so Meadow knew no different. Meadow grew up joining me at the appointments. There was no fear in attending a doctor's surgery. There was no fear about visiting mum in hospital, because that's where mummy goes sometimes to have a rest. And it was a really normal part of our lives. And I talk to Meadow a lot about it now. Meadow's 15 years old, and obviously she can speak very articulately about how she reflects on that time. And it wasn't until I had that collapse at home and the ambulance came that she thought that I might die. That's the first time there was a real serious conversation. And it initially was not with me, it was with my husband and my parents and Chris's parents, her nan and pop and her grandma and grandpa, who all sat down and said, you know, mummy is very unwell, but she's in the right place with the right people, and everyone is doing everything that they can to look after mum. And that is not for you to worry about. It is for the doctors to worry about. And if there are any ever questions that you want to ask, and our medical team were terrific, and the liver transplant team were terrific, and our nurses and our doctors, Sina and Damien, didn't just speak to me at my regular checkups. They would speak to Meadow as an 8-year-old and say, now, Meadow, is there anything that you would like to ask? Is there anything that you would like to know? And I still remember some of the questions she would ask. She would say, is there anything that I can do to help mum when she's at home? Or is there anything that I can bring into hospital that you can give her? Because during COVID, there was no visitors in hospital. So is there anything that I can bring from home to cheer mum up? And so I'm incredibly grateful.
They're amazing
Incredibly
questions.
grateful. Yeah, I'm very lucky. I've got a great kid.
And as an articulate 15-year-old she is now, when she looks back on that time, what does she remember? Do you talk about that?
Yeah, it makes me incredibly emotional thinking about it.
We don't have to go there if you're not comfortable.
No, absolutely. It's important. It's part of it. I often ask her what part of the experience she still carries, because like all serious health conditions, it's not just the patient that feels it. I definitely know that both my husband, my mother, and my daughter carry the trauma of particularly the transplant experience. And Meadow still says that her biggest fear was that Daddy was going to be alone. She still says, I just was really worried about Dad. I didn't think that Dad could live with a broken heart. So she didn't actually think about herself. Children are incredibly, incredibly resilient things. And she said, I was going to miss you, but I thought, how am I going to look after Dad with a broken heart? And she still says that. She still, I don't know where that comes from. She still says the worst part. She said, I would have been sad if you died, Mum. I would have been sad. But I was really worried about Dad, and, I was going to make sure that I was going to take really good care of him. And so it still breaks my heart.
It sounds like you've had a unbelievable community of support throughout this very tumultuous and challenging time to not only support you, but obviously your Meadow and your husband. You've mentioned your mum. How important was that to actually make sure you had a support network around you?
Incredibly important. I often, when I speak about my transplant journey, I often reflect that it's not mine. It's not solely my journey. It's our journey. It's our family's experience. And often now that I am post-transplant, and I actually think about it a lot in terms of all the people waiting that don't have the support that I had. Waiting is an incredibly challenging time as a human. You draw on the depths of hope and strength and resilience that you have. And there are so many days when you run out. There are so many days. And I always had someone there to fill me up. I always had my husband. My husband never doubted in front of me, never doubted that I was going to receive a transplant. And every day that I wandered down that rabbit hole of thinking this was it, I'm not going to make it, I'm too sick, and it's just not on the cards for me, he would almost flippantly say, Jess, she'll be right, mate. We've got this. And to know what I know now, that he was terrified that how I was feeling might actually happen, but he refused to let me show it. That stubborn, lovely, old-fashioned man that I've married refused to give up hope for me when I had given up hope. And so my mother and my twin sister, Catherine, and my dad became an ecosystem of hope. My dad would turn up to my doorstep when I refused to see people and I was being belligerent and difficult, and Chris couldn't handle it. And my dad would walk into the house and say, come on, Jess, we're going to walk up and down the hallway until you feel better. My mum would sneakily make me food from my childhood because I was rapidly losing weight by that time. And one of the really critical things about being on the transplant list is having enough weight left on your body to survive the surgery, because a transplant surgery is between 8 and 12 hours. It's a marathon.
Mm.
And by that time, I'd whittled down to about 49 kilos. Now, for someone that's 5'9.5", that's not enough weight to carry on my frame. And so my mum was lacing food with thickened cream and slabs of butter everywhere, and I just refused to eat. But she kept making it anyway. So when you talk about the power of the people around a patient with a chronic illness or a really serious illness, there is a superhuman power that comes from the hope that those people give. And I'm forever grateful to those people that carry the trauma of that experience with them, of me not recognizing them, me refusing to eat, me not knowing who was asking me questions, not knowing how to respond. I think about all the difficult times they must have been through. And, you know, particularly my husband, I still don't know how he did it, because it must have been incredibly hard to see the shell of the person that he married essentially wasting away.
You do have me intrigued, Jess. What were the childhood recipes that your mum was bringing out for you? What were your favourite things that she was actually trying to entice you with?
Oh, she was trying to entice me with all sorts of things. We can never go past, you know, a good custard, you know, plenty of eggs, whipping it through. She was making me like full milk, the good old fashioned full milk Milo, trying to force me to eat the good old coddled egg, you know, all of those old, and, you know, slabs of buttered toast with those eggs. I thought she could just open, you know, a slab of Lurpak butter and just slap it on everything that I put into my mouth. But also the treats, there was a ridiculous amount of, you know, she used to make Florentines. I would just have boxes. She would just
Oh,
arrive on a
wow.
Monday. She would just arrive every Sunday night with just boxes and boxes of chocolate covered cherry cornflake Florentines. And every time, like, breakfast, she would be serving me breakfast and a Florentine and a Milo. And then it would get to morning tea and it would be custard and a full cream Milo or a coffee and a Florentine. I had Florentines 24/7 for a long, long time. And it's probably a habit that's crept into my regular life post transplant. And quite often, if I went into hospital, even after my transplant, mum arrived into the transplant unit post transplant. She's like, "Are you allowed to eat Florentines yet?" I
Love
think it
it.
was, I think it was as cathartic for my mum to be doing something and physically working out her anxiety and knowing that it was something that I was going to eat.
I love that. And your dad, you mentioned him when he came to you, walking you down the corridor when you were being, I think you used the word belligerent.
Yep.
And I think that's a really good example that not everything is good, is it? The emotions, like there's a whole spectrum of emotions you must experience during that time. Can you talk me through those range and what you were experiencing and how that impacted on your relationships with friends? And, you've touched it quite a bit on family, but just more that sort of outer circle as well.
It's fair to say that once you are waitlisted for a transplant, your world becomes very small. For anyone that is listening who is waitlisted or who is isolated because of their health status, your world becomes incredibly small. And particularly at that time for me, I couldn't risk being physically in contact with people due to the risk of COVID or contracting an illness. I was incredibly unwell, and catching a cold could have been life threatening for me. And so the lack of contact and the feelings of isolation and the loss of physical touch with my family in particular. And as I became weaker and weaker, not being able to hold my child, you know, you never knew when a bad day was coming. And it's really interesting. I talked to Chris about it a bit, and he started to identify when a bad day was coming because, unbeknownst to me, during the night time while I was asleep, I quite often called out in pain, and he would wake up and just wait and see if he needed to give me some pain medication to put me back to sleep. And he said, I always knew when a bad day was going to happen because it always started with a bad night. And it was those days where I would wake up and I didn't realize that I'd been in pain for a long, long time, but asleep. And I would refuse to take my medication. And Chris would make me multiple breakfasts. No, I don't want that. He'd make a coffee. No, I don't want that. Make eggs on toast. No, I don't want that. And it got to the point where Chris didn't know what else to do. You don't go to hospital because your wife won't take her medicine or eat her food. And that's when they called in the big guns, mum and dad. And, you know, I'm very grateful to my family. I'm actually very grateful to Chris for being humble enough to ask for help. It's really difficult. It's really difficult. I'm coming to learn for what a lot of people treat chronic illness as a private thing that they don't want to burden other people with. But it certainly got to the point where I'm sure Chris nearly broke down himself because everything he did, I would refuse. And it was nothing to do with Chris. It was all about how I was feeling. And I just did not feel well enough to do a thing, not one thing. And it wasn't often until either my dad turned up or my nursing team came to our house every day at 11 o'clock. Every day at 11 o'clock, they would come into my room, they would take my obs, they would draw blood. By that time, I had a permanent medical pack called a Baxter bottle that was intravenously permanently infused into my arm. And every day, the pharmacy would drop off the new round of medicine to insert into my IV. And so quite often, Chris will have tried to talk me into eating or taking my medicine for 3 or 4 hours until 11 o'clock. And it wasn't until the nursing staff arrived and the nursing staff would say, Jess, you need to take your medicine and you've got to drink that drink to have your medicine. And I would just do it. I would do it. And so understanding the enormous level of frustration I'm sure all of my family experienced at one point or another, particularly in that last 12 months when I was really unwell. So I collapsed late in 2019. I spent most of 2020 regaining consciousness and strength. And then I was well enough to go through workup week and be waitlisted at the start of 2021. And I did not receive my transplant until the February of 2022. So all of 2021 was a bit of a blur for my family.
And you mentioned the allied health professionals that you had around you. What did that look like at the different stages as you worked through that? And you mentioned earlier on that you had private health insurance, and that was very instrumental when you had Meadow. But if you can just talk through the support. So we know the family was really instrumental, but who outside that was helping you on a daily basis, or what was the sort of regime like?
So I'm very, very fortunate. I look back on it now and, they quite often talk about the disparity between patients that are, you know, situated in metropolitan cities versus rural and regional patients. And, living on the surf coast just outside of Geelong, it's nearly a 2-hour trip to the Austin. It's very difficult to be a patient with a chronic illness without a medical team that supports both regional appointments and metropolitan appointments, because no one wants to take a very unwell, cranky patient in the car up the Melbourne highway for a 4-hour round trip for a half-hour appointment. And so because of COVID, in many respects, I was fortunate. The rise of telehealth really, until that time, hadn't been used a lot by the transplant unit. And all of a sudden, everything became a telehealth appointment. So I had a really crucial team, my gastroenterology team, I had my pathology team, my GP, I had my endocrinologist, I had a physio, I had a massage regularly, and also had to see the dentist quite regularly as well, because when you're taking the medication, either a heavy steroid load or the complexity of the medicines that I was taking was a real draw on my natural store of calcium. So checking my bone density and my oral health was also a critical part, because again, any infection that stems from the mouth or the bone could have put my eligibility for transplantation at risk. So by the end of it, I started off with 3 doctors, and right before transplant, it's fair to say, and I often refer to them as my footy team, I had well over 30 medical professionals, all having inputs from my hospital and the health, my HITH guys and girls who would roll into my house every day of the week, 7 days a week, my pathology team. Because of my status, I couldn't just turn up at a PATH centre and sit in the waiting area and be exposed to the public. So my local pathology would open 15 minutes early. I would be the first one in the door, no one else around. They'd draw my blood. I'd be able to go home again. All of that team, we definitely have a bit of a moral contract for life. I often see them still in the circles. I still get my regular checkups. I still get my regular blood tests, all part of making sure I'm taking incredibly good care of my new liver. And it is such a joy to see them and be well. Geelong, I'm very fortunate, is still a bit of a small place. And so it's really interesting the relationship that we carry now that I am well.
And let's look at that time that you were talking about, that waiting period, from the sort of day one to whatever could be up to 18 months. What did that look like for you?
In the beginning, once you're waitlisted, going through workup week is no small thing. I know it just sounds like, you know, 5 days in hospital and appointments and doctors, but it's incredibly filled with all of the complex human emotions because every test you're hoping that you're well enough. So every time, you do a stress test on your heart to make sure your heart can survive 12 hours of surgery is incredibly stressful. So every appointment that you're turning up, you're hoping they don't find something that makes you ineligible. So that whole week, my mum came with me. My mum was with me for every test. She sat outside the door, waiting, talking to me before I went in, catching me and all of my emotions every time I walked out of a test, whilst Chris was at home caring for Meadow, trying to carry on life as normal. And once I was waitlisted, there's a moment of sheer relief. And you think, right, I'm done with that part now. I've run that race and I'm over the finish line. And then you just quickly realize you're starting the next leg of the race. And I became a professional patient, is the only way to describe it. In those first few months, I just really focused on what I had to do. And I had structure. By then, they had returned to school for moments, for sort of a couple of months at a time, and then there'd be another lockdown and she'd be back home at the kitchen table again. But we found a rhythm. And so I knew that I just had to get up and do my blood test and take my medicine and eat breakfast, and I could eat it nice and slow as long as I'd eaten it by the time the nurse turned up at the doorbell rang at 11 o'clock. I'd have my appointment. It would always take about an hour. And then I would ring my mum. I rang my mum probably 3 or 4 times every day on the days that she wasn't physically with me. And it's a really interesting looking back on it. I just wanted company. The loneliness is really challenging. And I listened a lot to podcasts. I would ring my mum on FaceTime and she would sit me on her kitchen counter and she would just be making Florentines or cooking lunch or sorting washing or feeding the dog. And she would just be nattering about all that was going on in her world just so I had company. Whenever my sister could be there, and to be honest, incredibly difficult for my twin sister to see me get sick because there's nothing like watching your mirror image, like the person who has been your person your entire life, slowly disintegrate. And there were quite often times when I was chronically unwell and I was in a hospital for long periods of time. My sister would come in, and depending on how sick I was, she would refuse to leave and she would be sleeping in the seat next to me, particularly when I was in Melbourne and away from my family. I can still remember there was a time where, and I didn't know who I was, and I was kind of speaking gibberish and I wasn't really coherent. And she refused to leave and she slept on the floor in my room because she wanted to be my health advocate. And waiting takes a terrible toll on your psyche. And as I've mentioned previously, I don't know what the answer is. Waiting 400 odd days is hard. And there are definitely the days where I didn't carry the hope, but I had someone carrying it for me. And so if anyone out there is waiting, you've still got to keep living while you're waiting. And I'm very lucky in that I had a young child in my life who
when I was at home. She filled my life with purpose. And so when I gave up hope for myself, I kept fighting to be her mother. That's why I talk about it, right? Because there are so many people that are living this experience. 1,800 people are on the wait list for an organ, and about 7,000 more people that would benefit from a kidney transplant, that all on some level are tackling this challenge of holding on to hope. It's a real thing. And I think that, people with other serious prognoses, it's something that I had in common both with my father and my father-in-law, who's no longer with us, when they both had their cancer diagnosis. It's something that I acutely related to, is the holding on to hope is an important part of any serious health diagnosis, particularly when the prognosis is terminal, or at least very seriously life-threatening without treatment or without medical intervention. And holding on to hope becomes your job. And if you can't do it for yourself, do it for the people around you that are desperately holding on to hope for you.
And moving on to your notification that you had found a donor, talk me through that process. How was the news delivered? What was then that happened? What was the time frame?
I can remember it like it was yesterday. It was a Thursday afternoon. It was around school pickup time. So Chris had just literally walked out the door to go and collect Meadow. I was sitting at home like I always did, in bed by that stage. I was pretty horizontal for most of the day by then. I was too unstable on my feet to walk unassisted. And so I was in bed with my mobile phone and my home phone sitting next to me like I always did, with my go bag at the front door that had been sitting there for nearly a year by that time. And the phone rang and I saw that it was the Austin phone number. And I had had a telehealth with the Austin that morning. And so I thought they were ringing me back to tell me something, whether I had a new script or whether I needed to go and get another. But I thought they were ringing to tell me something that they didn't tell me at my morning appointment. But it wasn't. The phone rang and I picked up the phone and it was Angela, the transplant coordinator. And I realised that it was Angela. And it's like time stopped. I actually heard the words, "Jess, we have a liver for you." And then I don't remember anything else. I dropped the phone. I started crying. And unbeknownst to me, Chris and Meadow had walked in the front door as I'd answered the phone. And so they've walked past the bedroom door and I'm crying and screaming. And on the phone is talking, saying, "Hello, pick up, pick up, pick up." And my husband picked the phone up and really quickly figured out what was going on. Meadow jumped onto the bed and into my arms. And all of a sudden I realised that I might survive. And pretty quickly also realised that for me to receive that call, that someone had lost their life and that there was a family that were experiencing unimaginable loss. So I could receive that phone call. But I didn't really have time to do much else. I held on to Better for a long, long time. Chris hung up the phone and he said, "Jess, you've got to get organised now. You have to do exactly what I tell you." And surprisingly, I was a very good patient and I did everything that Chris told me to do. We had our bags ready. Meadow's godparents took care of her and Chris drove me up to the Austin. We were in the middle of another lockdown, believe it or not, at that time. And so Chris was not allowed into the hospital apart from waiting with me in the initial waiting area. I didn't say goodbye to Meadow. I said I would talk to you soon because I couldn't say goodbye. And Chris stayed with me. I had my COVID screening. They would not take me through without passing a swab and then an auxiliary secondary test. And once I had been cleared that I was COVID free, Chris didn't say goodbye either. He said, I'll see you real soon. And that's when I was taken away. I went into pre-op. The team are incredible. It's like a regular day at the office for them. I think my life is fundamentally changing forever, and they're all as relaxed and it's hard not to get sucked in, right? They're all really relaxed. I was like, well, maybe I should relax too. I was still really nervous. I was still waiting for the surgeon to come out and say, yep, the liver's healthy enough, because that is a huge risk with transplants, and they talk you through it. It's part of the education that you get as a waitlisted patient, is that you might get the phone call, but by the time you might arrive, the surgical team might have assessed the organ, and for whatever reason, they've deemed that the organ is unsuitable for transplant. And so I didn't really relax, even though the pre-op team had me gowned up and, I had the hairnet on and they were trying to keep it light and fun. It wasn't until the surgeons walked out of the theatre and said, well, we're ready when you are, Jess, that I finally let it sink in that everything was going to be okay.
My goodness, what a moment, Jess. And then what, you had to count back from 10?
Yeah, that's right. I did that part where I was actually very, very weak. As my husband would say quite cheekily, he would say, Jess, you were a bag of bones by the time I took you to hospital. You were a living skeleton. You were so skinny. And so the whole medical team transfer you in there, and they were hilarious. They were picking, their music, and they wanted to make sure that I was happy with their music selection. And by the time I laughed at their joke, I was out. I was gone. I was on my way to being well.
And tell me, what was it like when you came out the other side?
I consciously woke up 3 days after my transplant. I'd been awake a couple of times apparently, but was heavily, heavily sedated with a mixture of medication, mainly pain medication, and some antibiotics to prevent infection post-transplant. But it was day 3 that I woke up and started asking for Chris, my husband, and kind of reverted back to being that bad patient again, where I just refused to do anything until I could speak to Chris. I said, I just want to speak to my husband. I just want him to know that I'm okay. And then after that, the team came in, and I looked a bit like an octopus. I had lines coming out of my neck and out of my arms and out of my legs. I was still in the intensive care unit, and they offered me some food. And I was like, yeah, I'm starving. I'm absolutely starving. And then I started laughing. And the nurses were like, are you okay? And I'm like, I haven't been hungry in a year. And so I knew that I was well. I knew that it had worked. And I knew the sheer relief that just waves and waves and waves of relief. And I'm sure that the intensive care team thought that I was high on life, because I was, for the first time. And this is another thing about chronic illness, right? You never notice how sick you are, because you just get a little bit sicker every day, a little bit sicker, a little bit sicker, and you slowly retreat from your well life. But you only do it little bit by little bit. So you stop making phone calls, and you stop meeting people for coffee, and you stop emailing people, and then you stop texting, and then you stop looking at your phone, and then you don't watch television. And so that retreat had been so gradual over those 407 days that all of a sudden I was well. And I was like, I've got to get to it. When am I getting out of intensive care? When can I go to the ward? When can I see Meadow? When can I speak to my family? I was like, I've got to go. I've got life. I've got stuff to do. And so it was really interesting that it was like flipping a switch from night to day. I went from being almost on death's door to having that door reopened and a whole long life being there waiting for me to embrace it. And so I leaned really, really hard into my recovery. I made it in and out post transplant and back home in 28 days, which is an incredibly short recovery period. Most people are a month, 5 weeks, 6 weeks post transplant. I was desperate to get home. I was desperate to get home to Meadow. And I treated being a patient like my full-time job. They came around and said, let's do some physio. I did physio. I did extra physio. When they came round and said, here's your meal plan, we'd like you to try and eat everything, I would sit there with my meal tray and force myself to eat everything, even when I didn't really want to. I was desperate to get home and restart my life. I was desperate to show Meadow that I was doing everything I could to get back to her and to let Chris know that he had his person back. It was me, it was Jess, that I was coming back to him.
And 3 years on now, Jess, looking back in hindsight, what has the whole experience sort of informed how you view life now and your future?
Look, it's fair to say the life that I led before this experience is very, like, vastly different. Like, I almost don't recognize the life that I had before falling pregnant with Meadow. I worked a full-time, busy job in the public service. I worked in the media. I would quite easily work a 10, 12-hour day, 5 days a week. I really prioritized work and not the rest of my life and the rest of myself. And life is really different now. In many respects, I would say life is really simple. I don't do anything that isn't purposeful with my life. First and foremost, my priorities are my family. My family carried me through a really difficult chapter of my life. And I don't think I would be here today had it not been for their sacrifice. And I owe them. I owe them to show up and be present and participate fully in my life in all things, not just the things that are my preference, but in the things that are Meadow's preference and Chris's preference. And so it does mean challenging myself to do things that aren't in my wheelhouse. We recently had a trip, a family holiday, our first family holiday overseas since being ill. And we went zip lining down the mountains in Fiji. Not my first choice, but it was definitely time for Chris, Meadow, and myself to start making family memories that are centered around wellness. So that was my immediate priority. The other really big part of my life that's changed is the sense of responsibility that I carry with me. You know, in a sliding doors moment, someone's life ended so my life could continue. And whilst my family were sitting in a hospital room hoping for the best, someone else and their immediate family were sitting in a hospital room grieving an unimaginable and unexpected loss. And so to understand the gravity and the profoundly human experience of that sliding doors moment is not lost on me and it's not lost on my family. And so I choose differently. I don't sweat the small stuff anymore. I don't get caught up in the daily news. I don't complain about waiting in line for coffee. I'm not one of those drivers that gets too annoyed by traffic. Because what's the point when you're given a second chance at living a full and healthy life? You've got to be all in, right? What a second chance it's for. And so I do talk about organ donation. I talk about the profound gift that it is. I'm a passionate health advocate. I work closely with Barwon Health, the Geelong Health and Hospital Network. I'm a part of their consumer advisory board. I work very closely with Austin Health and the Australian Centre for Transplantation Excellence and Research at Austin Health. And of course, every Donate Life Week and every opportunity that I can speak to medical teams and up and coming nursing staff. Tomorrow, I'm speaking with the incredible medical students that are studying medicine at Melbourne University so they can hear from the lived experience of a patient that has been through a chronic illness diagnosis and has come out the other side, because a second chance at life does matter, and what you do with your time matters. And I have to, because the most important thing that I can do is honour my donor and honour her family, because I carry her legacy with me. I carry the gift with me. You know, my story is definitely my own and deeply personal, but I share it with my family and I share it with her family because it's a shared experience. And that's why I speak. You know, our legacy lives on every time I make a school drop off, every time I'm cheering Meadow on from the side of a basketball court, you know, every time I'm there for a home cooked meal with my husband, every time I'm wrapping Christmas presents to put under the tree, those moments I owe to them. I owe them every single minute. And so I live my life in a way so I can, when my time finally comes, I can hold my head up high and fully acquit myself to whatever comes next and know that I've done everything that I can to ensure that if I can affect positive change to people that are waiting, to families that are waiting with their loved ones, to donor families that have given the incredibly special gift of life, and to our up and coming medical staff and our medical students that are learning how to be the fantastic doctors of the future, if there's anything that I can do to pay it forward so others can have a better, more fulsome, more holistic transplant experience, that's what I feel like might be my legacy. And, you know, I am and always will be forever grateful to my donor and her family.
Jess, I think sharing your story today has really provided insight that we don't normally get to the donor process. And I really appreciate you taking your time and sharing really raw emotions and vulnerability of that story. So thank you so much.
Look, thank you so much for having me, Catherine. And, you know, I always say when I'm talking about this particular part of my life, organ donation didn't just save my life, it gave my daughter back her mother, and it gave my husband back his wife. And my parents didn't bury their child. It is a profoundly far reaching gift, and we will always be forever grateful. So thank you so much for having me.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.